the billionaire who conquered everyone, until he was defeated by an unknown woman. Every empire has its king, and every king has a secret weakness that could topple his throne. In the world of high-stakes business and untold wealth, Jonathan Ashcroft reigned supreme until one mysterious woman shattered his impenetrable armor. From lavish penthouse parties in Manhattan to candlelit negotiations in secret boardrooms, Jonathan's saga is a tumultuous ride of triumphs, betrayals, and hidden motives. He was the billionaire who conquered everyone, his rivals the media and even governments. But in the end, one unknown woman had the power to bring him to his knees, leaving behind a trail of secrets and shattered dreams. Jonathan Ashcroft was not born into wealth. The man who would one day wield unimaginable influence began his life in a cramped two-room apartment on the south side of Chicago. His parents, William and Maria Ashcroft, worked multiple jobs, his father as a mechanic and his mother as a waitress to provide for their small family. Despite the hardships, they never wavered in their dedication to their son's future. Their story was one of resilience and unwavering faith in the promise of the American dream. Jonathan's father introduced him to the art of fixing things at a young age. From bicycles to old radios, William taught Jonathan the value of practical problem-solving. Even as a child, Jonathan displayed a knack for innovation and an unyielding determination that often led him to skip typical childhood pleasures. While other kids were out playing ball or video games, Jonathan was holed up in his makeshift workshop, tinkering with parts and dreaming of a life far beyond the horizon of his modest neighborhood. One of the earliest and most formative events in Jonathan's life was a worn copy of Andrew Carnegie's autobiography that he found in a used bookstore. Reading about the steel tycoon's rise from poverty to staggering success became the spark that ignited Jonathan's own ambitions. He devoured the pages, memorizing lines that celebrated the spirit of entrepreneurship, philanthropic duty, and unwavering self-belief. This battered paperback shaped the teenage Jonathan's worldview, instilling in him both the desire to amass wealth and the urge to wield influence for a cause greater than himself. Yet the environment around Jonathan was hardly conducive to his aspirations. Crime rates were high in his neighborhood, and the future seemed bleak for many of his classmates. Drugs and gang violence overshadowed the hopeful spark in many young minds. But Jonathan refused to succumb to the fatalism that plagued so many. Instead, the hardships fueled his drive. He learned to navigate dangerous streets with caution and an acute sense of self-preservation qualities that would later translate into his shrewd business dealings. When Jonathan turned 16, his father suffered a back injury that made it impossible for him to continue work as a mechanic. Overnight, the financial burden on the family doubled. In response, Jonathan took a weekend job at a local electronics shop, determined to lighten the load. Observing the store's inventory and customers, he quickly identified patterns in what sold best and the kind of after-sales services that were in high demand. Even as a teenage employee, Jonathan couldn't resist making suggestions to his manager about how to optimize the store's layout and pricing strategies. While the manager initially brushed him off, it wasn't long before Jonathan's ideas turned stagnant inventory into profit. By the time Jonathan was ready to graduate high school, he had saved enough money to help his parents move to a slightly better neighborhood. He was also accepted into the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign on a partial scholarship. There he majored in computer science, captivated by the era's burgeoning tech revolution. Like many tech geniuses, he spent countless nights in the university's computer labs, working on cutting-edge projects and forging relationships with like-minded peers. Despite his modest beginnings, Jonathan's relentless ambition and ingenious mind began to catch the attention of certain influential professors. Some recognized in him a rare blend of technical prowess and business acumen. Others noted his extraordinary discipline and willingness to challenge established norms. One professor, Dr. Emilia Liu, became a mentor figure steering Jonathan toward opportunities in research and entrepreneurship programs. Under her guidance, Jonathan's vision crystallized technology was the key to reshaping industries and, in turn, reshaping his own destiny. From Chicago's gritty streets to university lecture halls, Jonathan's foundational years were marked by resilience, curiosity, and the desire for more. He had no inkling that the path he was carving steadily, diligently would eventually lead him to the pinnacle of wealth and power. Nor could he predict how his single-minded pursuit of success would sow the seeds for his own dramatic downfall. Graduating at the top of his class, Jonathan found himself courted by some of Silicon Valley's elite companies. Google, Apple, Microsoft each saw potential in the bright young man who had already published research on emerging software algorithms, rather than settling for a comfortable six-figure job right out of college. Jonathan took a bold leap. He launched his first startup, CodeLock. The premise behind CodeLock was simple yet visionary. Create an unbreakable encryption platform for the everyday consumer. This was the early 2000s, a time when cybersecurity was becoming increasingly vital to both corporations and private citizens alike. Jonathan's mission was to democratize security, making it accessible and user-friendly without compromising on quality. Armed with a small but talented team of fellow graduates, Jonathan set up shop in a tiny rented office near Palo Alto. They survived on ramen noodles and energy drinks, coding through sleepless nights, troubleshooting and rewriting entire modules when the platform failed to meet the perfectionist standards Jonathan demanded. Within a year, CodeLock had garnered the attention of major tech blogs and won a prominent industry award for innovation. Jonathan's first real breakthrough came when CodeLock signed a deal with a mid-sized financial institution to secure their online banking platform. The deal, though small in the grand scheme of banking, validated CodeLock's reliability. As word spread, larger financial players soon followed suit. JP Morgan expressed interest in the encryption solution. Suddenly, Jonathan's once scrappy startup found itself in advanced talks with banking giants who wanted state-of-the-art cybersecurity. But not everyone viewed Jonathan as an ally. Established cybersecurity companies like McAfee and Symantec eyed this newcomer with a mix of skepticism and quiet concern. Jonathan was known for his brash confidence and willingness to undercut prices if it meant gaining market share. Privately, many industry veterans dismissed him as just another Silicon Valley hotshot who would burn out quickly. Jonathan's answer was CodeLock's unstoppable growth. It was around this time that he attended his first high-profile tech conference. A-listers like Bill Gates and Larry Ellison were scheduled to speak. Jonathan, a mere panel guest, caught the attention of none other than Peter Thiel, the PayPal co-founder, known for his ability to spot disruptive ventures. With Thiel's mentorship and an injection of venture capital, CodeLock scaled rapidly. Offices opened in New York, London, and Berlin. A hush fell over the old guard of cybersecurity. It was clear this wasn't just another startup. Though success looked immediate, it was anything but effortless. Jonathan faced a barrage of challenges, from unforeseen security breaches that threatened to tarnish CodeLock's reputation to intense regulatory scrutiny. In one notable incident, a hacker group known as Cypher Eclipse claimed they had cracked CodeLock's signature encryption. Stocks tumbled, employees panicked, and critics declared it the end of Jonathan's meteoric rise. Undeterred, Jonathan took to the stage at a press conference, brandishing new data that showed the infiltration was limited to a single unupdated segment of the software. He personally thanked Cypher Eclipse for exposing a vulnerability, framed it as an opportunity to strengthen Code Lock, and even offered them a short-term consulting contract to bolster the platform's defenses. The audacity of the move stunned the tech world and turned the crisis into a publicity triumph. His personal life, however, began to fray at the edges. The grueling demands of running a global startup left little time for relationships. Friends who had once been close found themselves replaced by colleagues and investors. Jonathan's relationship with his parents also took a distant turn. William Ashcroft now partially recovered from his injury, and Maria worried about their son's obsessive drive. Phone calls became less frequent, and visits back home almost non-existent. Within 3 years, Code Lock's IPO catapulted Jonathan from a humble entrepreneur to a bona fide tech billionaire. His face graced the covers of Forbes, Wired, and Business Insider. Rumors swirled that Jonathan was planning to acquire smaller cybersecurity firms to build a tech empire. He purchased a sleek penthouse overlooking San Francisco Bay and hired a personal driver to shuttle him to and from private meetings. Still, for all his calculated risk-taking, Jonathan remained intensely private about his personal dreams and vulnerabilities. He rarely appeared at social galas unless they offered some business advantage. The press began to paint him as the lone wolf billionaire, a man who could charm investors yet appeared cold and clinical in personal settings. Little did Jonathan know that beyond the dazzling lights of corporate triumph lurked a web of manipulation, jealousy, and hidden agendas. He was standing at the summit of success, but the same mountain would prove far more treacherous to descend. For every friend he had made, there were enemies waiting in the shadows, and one unknown woman in particular, whose name he had yet to learn, a woman who would one day bring his kingdom to its knees. With Code Lock's prominence rising, Jonathan's presence in the business world became impossible to ignore. He was invited to speak at prestigious global forums and mingled with the titans of industry. At an exclusive gathering in Sun Valley, he found himself rubbing shoulders with Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and Warren Buffett, names that had once seemed untouchable. But now Jonathan was among them, earning his place in the pantheon of moguls shaping the future. His determination to remain ahead often led to bold strategies. One such move was the hostile takeover of TitanSec, a smaller cybersecurity firm that had developed a specialized firewall technology rumored to be a game-changer. Negotiations were tense. TitanSec's board initially resisted any takeover bids, bristling at the idea of being swallowed by Jonathan's empire. Undeterred, Jonathan lobbied shareholders directly. He leveraged Code Lock's network, forging alliances with banks that threatened to withdraw financial services from TitanSec unless they entered serious negotiations. Ultimately, TitanSec capitulated. The move was criticized in the press as ruthless and heavy-handed. Jonathan, who carefully curated his public image, shrugged off the bad press. In an interview with Bloomberg, he justified the takeover by emphasizing synergy and shared innovation goals. "We don't conquer," he said with a composed smile. "We collaborate, integrate, and elevate." It was a sound bite that quickly went viral, drawing as much praise from corporate admirers as it did ire from those who saw him as a megalomaniac in the making. Not everyone in the industry bent the knee. A vocal critic emerged in the form of Belinda Maxwell, the CEO of Safeguard, another cybersecurity giant that prided itself on transparency and fair business practices. Belinda had built her company from the ground up, focusing on public sector contracts and forging strong government ties. She believed in ethical growth, something she felt Jonathan had overlooked in his race to the top. On several occasions, she publicly challenged Jonathan's tactics, calling him the tyrant of tech. Ever opportunistic, Jonathan decided to beat Belinda at her own game. He began courting government agencies with CodeLock's next-generation encryption products. He made frequent trips to Washington, D.C., lobbying senators and forging strategic partnerships with defense contractors. Rumors swirled that he had gained powerful allies within the Department of Defense. Belinda's hold on government contracts began to slip, and Safeguard's shares dipped. This corporate warfare spilled into the media, with headlines pitting Jonathan Ashcroft against Belinda Maxwell. Tech analysts debated which approach, Jonathan's aggressive expansion or Belinda's measured ethics, would ultimately prevail. Through it all, Jonathan maintained an unyielding calm. This was, after all, part of the game, the forging of alliances, the dismantling of obstacles, and the ascension to an undisputed pinnacle of corporate power. Meanwhile, Jonathan began receiving strange communications. Anonymous emails arrived in his personal inbox messages that bypassed CodeLock's sophisticated filters. The contents of these messages were cryptic, a single line of text here, an image of a lone chess piece there. At first, Jonathan dismissed them as pranks from an over-enthusiastic hacker. But the frequency of these messages increased, each more ominous than the last. One particular email contained a photograph of Jonathan entering a top-secret meeting in Washington. The subject line read, "Every fortress has a blind spot." Attached was a snippet of code that appeared to exploit a vulnerability in CodeLock's own software. Furious, Jonathan ordered an internal investigation, suspecting an inside leak. But the team found no evidence of internal wrongdoing. If the messages weren't coming from inside CodeLock, who had the resources to track Jonathan so closely? Despite the unnerving implications, Jonathan pressed on. He found a powerful ally in Bradley Morgan, a rising senator from Texas who championed increased cybersecurity funding for government agencies. Their partnership was symbiotic. Senator Morgan gained visibility and campaign donations, while Jonathan positioned CodeLock as the government's go-to solution for national security. The relationship caused a stir among Jonathan's critics, who saw it as a new level of crony capitalism. But within the closed circles of power, the arrangement solidified Jonathan's standing. His schedule became a constant whirlwind of meetings, press briefings, and business deals. Investors clamored to buy shares in CodeLock, driving the stock price even higher. Quietly, Jonathan also began diversifying. Through shell companies and complex financial structures, he invested in real estate, pharmaceuticals, and even space technology, anything that promised cutting-edge innovation and exponential returns. Unknown to Jonathan, these calculated moves were slowly igniting a tinderbox of resentments and hidden vendettas. From disgruntled board members of acquired companies to social reformers who despised his methods. The circle of those who wished to see him fall was steadily expanding. Among them was a single unassuming figure, a woman who studied every victory, every headline, and every secret handshake with methodical precision. She remained nameless to the public, but for her, Jonathan Ashcroft was more than a rival. He was a mission. Jonathan was on top of the world, but each move he made also set the stage for the next act of his life, a drama that would prove far more perilous than any corporate maneuver he had ever faced. For all the power and wealth he amassed, Jonathan Ashcroft was, in many ways, an isolated figure. That realization came crashing down one evening at a gala in New York City, hosted by the philanthropic arm of the Gates Foundation. Jonathan had been invited as a guest speaker, and after delivering a polished address on the importance of cybersecurity for global health data, he found himself cornered by a throng of admirers and curious socialites. He smiled politely, fielding questions about CodeLock's latest advancements, but his mind was elsewhere. Across the room, he noticed a striking brunette in a simple black dress. Unlike the other attendees, she wasn't jostling for his attention. Instead, she observed him from a distance, swirling her glass of champagne with an air of indifferent poise. Intrigued, Jonathan excused himself and made his way toward her. Enjoying the gala, he asked with a practiced smile. She lifted her gaze, her eyes reflecting a mix of curiosity and something else, something akin to challenge. "Is that a question or a polite greeting?" She responded, an amused tilt to her lips. Taken aback, Jonathan introduced himself. "Jonathan Ashcroft," he offered, though he assumed she already knew. She gave a small nod. "Sabrina. And yes, the gala is fine, but I'm actually more interested in the behind-the-scenes operations where the real moves happen." Something in her voice piqued Jonathan's interest. He offered to fetch her a fresh drink, an uncharacteristic gesture for him. As they chatted, it became clear Sabrina was no ordinary partygoer. She was sharp, questioning him about the ethical implications of cybersecurity expansion and the delicate balance between privacy and protection. Jonathan found himself strangely disarmed. He seldom allowed anyone to get too close. He had learned early on that vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet Sabrina's intellect and unwavering gaze chipped away at his defenses. By the end of the evening, they left the gala together, slipping into Jonathan's private car. Their conversation was a whirlwind of ideas, philanthropic strategies, the moral weight of technology and how a single algorithm could topple a nation's defenses. For the next few weeks, Jonathan and Sabrina became inseparable. Late-night dinners in his penthouse, morning jogs through Central Park. Both activities foreign to Jonathan's usual routine. She challenged him on his corporate maneuvers, his unwavering belief in relentless expansion, and questioned whether his philanthropic gestures were genuine or merely strategic. Jonathan, for his part, felt a new pulse of life. For once he allowed himself to consider that a personal connection might not be a weakness, but something he'd been missing. The media speculated about the new woman on his arm, though Sabrina managed to maintain a low profile. She never flaunted her relationship with Jonathan publicly. Instead, she maintained her privacy, keeping journalists at bay. But as their bond grew, a dark undercurrent seeped in. Anonymous messages continued to flood Jonathan's inbox, this time with hints aimed at his burgeoning relationship. One particular email read, "She sees what you cannot." Attached was an out-of-focus photo of Sabrina and Jonathan, taken from an uncomfortably close vantage point. Alarmed, Jonathan tightened his personal security. Sabrina brushed off the messages as mere scare tactics from Jonathan's competitors. Yet Jonathan couldn't shake the sense of being watched, by who or for what purpose he couldn't be certain. He confided in Sabrina, admitting for the first time how precarious his position was in the industry. She comforted him, urging him to stay vigilant, but also reminding him that paranoia could devour him from the inside. In moments of candor, Jonathan admitted fears he had long kept buried. He told her about the distant relationship with his parents, the friends he'd lost in the whirlwind of work, and the moral compromises he sometimes made to fuel CodeLock's expansion. Sabrina listened unjudging, yet incisive in her observations. Despite these moments of honesty, Jonathan remained a puzzle. He revealed selective pieces of himself, but held back the entirety of his ambition's toll on his soul. Ironically, It was in Sabrina's presence that he felt most human, and paradoxically most aware of the illusions he'd built around himself. As he stood on the precipice of deeper intimacy, Jonathan began to sense that this was a turning point in his life. Sabrina represented a chance at something genuine. However, in the treacherous world he inhabited, genuine connections often came at a steep price. And unknown to him, the greatest test of his vulnerability was yet to come, orchestrated not by his usual corporate rivals, but by a figure far more elusive and far more dangerous. While Jonathan's relationship with Sabrina blossomed, an undercurrent of tension spread through CodeLock's executive suite. Whispers of leaked data and suspiciously timed market shifts troubled the top brass. Jonathan, consumed by his personal life and ongoing expansions, demanded investigations, but found nothing concrete. Unbeknownst to him, an invisible hand was orchestrating a delicate series of moves that would set him on a collision course with destiny. That invisible hand belonged to Aurelia Lancaster, a name that rarely appeared in public records, but surfaced in whispered anecdotes among high society circles. Born to British aristocrats, Aurelia vanished from the public eye after a series of tragic family incidents left her fortune entangled in legal disputes. Over the years, rumors placed her in Monaco, Hong Kong, or even remote corners of South America, always on the periphery of major financial events. Some said she was a cunning businesswoman who manipulated markets from behind a curtain of anonymity. Others believed her to be a philanthropist who discreetly funded social causes. In truth, Aurelia was both and neither. She had devoted her adult life to mastering the art of influence, forging alliances with powerful individuals, and collecting secrets like precious artifacts. She rarely appeared in person, preferring to use intermediaries and sophisticated online identities. Yet she meticulously studied Jonathan Ashcroft, tracking his every move. She pored over public filings, analyzed the acquisitions he made, and traced the philanthropic endeavors he engaged in, particularly those he never publicized. Aurelia's obsession with Jonathan was not random. In her labyrinthine search for answers to personal tragedies, she had come across a trail of corporate maneuvers that led her to CodeLock. She connected dots that revealed how certain unethical deals in Jonathan's empire had adversely affected small communities, even resulting in lost livelihoods, and in one case, a life. The details scattered across continents formed a mosaic that fueled Aurelia's conviction that Jonathan was not merely an ambitious mogul, but also a catalyst for real harm when his ambition collided with vulnerable lives. Over the past months, Aurelia orchestrated a subtle infiltration into CodeLock. Through shell companies, she employed cybersecurity experts who probed CodeLock's software for weaknesses. She established alliances with individuals who had grudges against Jonathan. Former board members of acquired firms, disgruntled employees who felt shortchanged by stock options, even certain philanthropic organizations wary of Jonathan's intentions. One by one, she pulled strings, funding quiet investigations and gathering intelligence. The cryptic messages that landed in Jonathan's inbox originated from Aurelia's network. Each was designed to unsettle him, to remind him that the fortress he believed to be impregnable had vulnerabilities. Aurelia watched as Jonathan tightened his security. She observed the effect of her psychological warfare, rattling him without driving him to complete paranoia. When Jonathan appeared on national television, praising CodeLock's role in bolstering defense systems, Aurelia took special interest. She wondered if he truly believed he was safeguarding the world, or if it was a convenient narrative to placate regulators. The truth, she suspected, was somewhere in the middle. Jonathan, in her estimation, was a man who saw himself as a guardian, while dismissing the collateral damage of his business tactics. Beyond the strategic moves, Aurelia found herself strangely fascinated by Jonathan's personal story. She noted his philanthropic gestures, sometimes genuine, sometimes purely for show. She tracked his abrupt shift toward private real estate ventures and investments in biotech firms that researched life extension technology. It intrigued her how a single individual could be so contradictory, altruistic on the surface, yet conducting hostile takeovers behind closed doors. She followed his blossoming romance with Sabrina from a distance, gleaning bits of information through subtle digital tracing. Sabrina was an unknown variable. Aurelia contemplated whether Sabrina might inadvertently thwart her plans, or perhaps become an ally. For now, Aurelia left her untouched an integral piece of the board she had yet to move. And so the woman the world did not know, and Jonathan could not conceive of, continued her quiet infiltration. Carefully, methodically, Aurelia positioned her pawns on a global chessboard. She had compromised key figures in the government, nudged them to question Codelock's military contracts. She nudged investigative journalists to look deeper into Jonathan's less publicized acquisitions. She funded private lawsuits from communities affected by those acquisitions, encouraging them to come forward with damaging testimonies. All of this was done behind a veil so thick that not even Jonathan, with his extensive resources, could pierce it. He sensed a looming threat, but he could not yet name it or trace its origin. In the shadows, Aurelia prepared for a calculated strike, one that would expose Jonathan's vulnerabilities in the most public and damaging way possible. She was not motivated by fame or wealth. She already had plenty of both. Her motivation was more potent justice retribution, and the unwavering belief that Jonathan Ashcroft's unchecked power needed to be dismantled. The pieces were moving, and soon Jonathan would discover that the greatest threat to his empire was not an old rival or a corporate boardroom ambush. It was a woman he had never met, whose name he did not know yet, who knew more about him than he could ever imagine. A shift in Codelock's atmosphere was palpable. Senior executives exchanged worried glances behind closed doors. Rumors of an impending corporate scandal buzzed through the corridors. Clients began to ask pointed questions about possible data leaks. Even Jonathan's most trusted advisors seemed on edge, each suspecting the other of betrayal. Unknown to them, Aurelia's machinations were accelerating. She had managed to recruit a mole, Preston Clark, a respected member of Codelock's legal team. Preston had harbored resentment ever since he felt unfairly bypassed for a promotion. He rationalized that if Jonathan didn't value his loyalty, then he had no reason to keep it. Aurelia's financial incentive only sealed the deal. Through Preston, Aurelia gained access to sensitive internal documents, contracts, settlement agreements, the skeletons hidden deep in Codelock's closet. She meticulously combed through them, noting every questionable transaction Jonathan had approved. Some showcased legitimate, if cutthroat, business deals. Others hinted at ethically grey maneuvers, hush-money payoffs, to keep whistleblowers silent, or shell company acquisitions that laundered Codelock's involvement in politically volatile regions. These were the explosives Aurelia needed to detonate Jonathan's carefully curated image. But Aurelia wasn't content to merely gather evidence. She also aimed to strike at Codelock's heart, its proprietary encryption technology. She commissioned a small group of elite hackers, digital ghosts, who specialized in breaching high-profile systems without a trace. Their mission: create an untraceable backdoor in Codelock's software. If successful, it would compromise the security of major government institutions, financial networks, and millions of individual users who relied on Codelock's encryption. Such a revelation could collapse Codelock overnight, sending shares plummeting and triggering a wave of lawsuits that would bury Jonathan. Aurelia, however, had no intention of allowing criminals free rein with the back door. Her plan was to expose its existence at the perfect moment, painting Jonathan as the man whose negligence endangered the global digital infrastructure. While Aurelia orchestrated her grand scheme, Jonathan found himself increasingly isolated. In a tense board meeting, CFO Madeleine Royce pressed him about rumors that the Department of Justice had opened an investigation into CodeLock's government contracts. Jonathan deflected, insisting it was business as usual. Yet he felt the pressure mount. Investors bombarded him with calls. Stock analysts demanded transparency. Seeking solace, Jonathan confided in Sabrina, who had become his emotional anchor. They met one late evening at his penthouse, he fresh from a day of damage control. She quietly concerned about his growing paranoia. Jonathan told her of strange dealings, the swirl of untraceable threats, and the gnawing feeling that someone knew his every move. Sabrina listened, gently massaging his temples as he recounted each event in growing agitation. Unknown to him, Aurelia's watchers recorded his penthouse arrival. They made no move to compromise his personal life, not yet. Their aim was not to unnerve him with petty intrusions, but to ensure every piece was in place for the final act. Then the first major crack appeared. A leaked document surfaced on an investigative journalist's blog, linking CodeLock to clandestine deals with a Middle Eastern dictatorship. The blog accused CodeLock of providing encryption software to a regime known for human rights abuses, enabling them to surveil dissidents. The claim went viral within hours. Protesters gathered outside CodeLock's San Francisco headquarters, demanding accountability. Jonathan immediately suspected sabotage. He launched an internal probe which led him to Preston Clark. But by then, Preston had covered his tracks cleverly. No direct evidence tied him to the leak. In the media, Jonathan denounced the accusations as either outdated or heavily distorted. He insisted that CodeLock had cut ties with the regime the moment human rights concerns were raised, if at all. Yet public faith wavered. Some in the tech community declared that even if CodeLock had distanced itself, the moral responsibility could not be so easily dismissed. Stocks dipped sharply for the first time since CodeLock's meteoric rise. Jonathan planned a press conference to control the narrative, but the damage was done. The public now sensed that CodeLock's pristine image might be a veneer. Aurelia was only getting started. She released a second wave of incriminating files, this time through multiple sources, painting a broader picture of Jonathan's questionable alliances. She timed the leaks to coincide with a Senate committee hearing on cybersecurity, amplifying the scandal. Senators demanded that Jonathan testify. In that moment, Jonathan felt the true weight of being at the center of a storm. He moved quickly, calling in favors from his political allies, including Senator Bradley Morgan. Quiet deals were brokered to minimize the fallout. But behind the scenes, even Morgan grew wary. The stench of controversy around CodeLock threatened his own political aspirations. Jonathan retreated further, confiding only in Sabrina and a handful of loyal executives. But each day, it seemed another dark secret emerged, each leak more damaging than the last. The corporate empire he had built with unyielding ambition was beginning to splinter beneath him. His legal team worked around the clock to manage the crisis, yet the onslaught felt coordinated, almost surgical in precision. As Aurelia watched the panic unfold from her hidden vantage points, she felt neither joy nor hesitation. She believed she was serving a purpose larger than revenge, unmasking the man whose unbridled ambition had cost lives and threatened others. Still, she knew the final decisive blow had yet to be delivered. All the while, Jonathan Ashcroft, the billionaire, who once seemed untouchable, fought to maintain control of his rapidly fraying empire. But the infiltration had already occurred. Betrayals multiplied. And unbeknownst to him, the greatest betrayal, the one that would unravel the last thread of his defenses, was about to surface from the most unexpected place. By the time Jonathan sat down in front of the Senate committee, the cracks in his armor had become visible to the world. Cameras flashed as he took his seat. A phalanx of lawyers and code lock executives positioned behind him. The committee room brimmed with tensioned journalists, hunched over their notepads, and political rivals eager to capitalize on any misstep. Senator Bradley Morgan, once a staunch ally, opened the proceedings with a carefully neutral statement. Mr. Ashcroft, our objective today is to clarify CodeLock's role in certain high-profile data breaches and questionable government contracts. We trust your testimony will shed light on the truth. Jonathan glanced around at the stern faces. He delivered a composed opening statement, emphasizing that CodeLock had always acted within legal and ethical bounds. His voice was measured carefully, omitting any details that could incriminate him or the company. But the senators came armed with a litany of leaked documents, each more damning than the last. How do you explain this email exchange with a representative from one senator began waving a printed thread? Jonathan refuted it as an exploration of a now-defunct deal. Another senator cited financial transfers to shell companies. Jonathan countered with half-truths about standard corporate structuring. The questioning pressed on, unrelenting. Throughout the hearing, Jonathan maintained a controlled demeanor, but inwardly he was fighting panic. He suspected that an unknown adversary was funneling confidential information to the Senate. At times he glanced at Sabrina, who was seated behind him for moral support. She offered a reassuring smile, but his gut churned with dread. The hearing concluded without a conclusive verdict, but the damage to Jonathan's reputation was undeniable. News outlets ran headlines like "Cyber King under fire" and "CodeLock's empire cracks." Investors panicked. Stock prices teetered on the brink of collapse. Back at CodeLock, the environment was apocalyptic. The board demanded immediate action to prevent further leaks. Executives suspected each other of being moles. Staff morale nosedived. Clients issued ultimatums threatening to pull contracts unless they received ironclad reassurances of CodeLock's integrity. The fortress Jonathan had built was under siege from within, and he still had no clear target for retaliation. In the midst of this chaos, Sabrina pleaded with Jonathan to step back and take a more measured approach. "Focus on what you can control," she urged. "Start by re-evaluating the deals that caused this scandal. Issue genuine apologies if necessary. Show the world you're committed to rectifying past mistakes." But Jonathan bristled at her advice. "People smell weakness," he snapped. "An apology is an admission of guilt. We have to project strength." Their argument escalated. Sabrina accused him of letting his pride and ambition overshadow the greater good, even overshadowing her attempts to help. Jonathan fired back that he was fighting for survival. If CodeLock collapsed, tens of thousands of employees worldwide could lose their jobs. Their quarrel ended with Sabrina storming out, tears glistening in her eyes. That night, Jonathan stood alone in his penthouse, staring at the city lights. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing a crucial puzzle piece, someone with both the resources and motive to orchestrate his downfall. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "When kings fall, the world watches." Are you watching? Jonathan's blood ran cold. Days later, a massive cybersecurity breach rattled the financial sector. An unknown entity exploited a hidden vulnerability in CodeLock's encryption to siphon sensitive data from several major banks. Panic gripped the markets. Shareholders rushed to offload CodeLock stocks. Public outcry soared. Politicians who only weeks before had relied on Jonathan's counsel now treated him like a pariah. Jonathan's top engineers scrambled to patch the vulnerability, but the damage was done. The hack was a catastrophic blow to CodeLock's credibility. Worse, an anonymous consortium threatened to release the stolen financial data unless CodeLock publicly admitted gross negligence. A wave of lawsuits loomed, each potentially worth billions. Amid the turmoil, Jonathan received a cryptic email. "Every fortress has a blind spot. You've met yours." Attached was a photo of an elegant woman in a tailored suit, her face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The email's metadata was expertly scrubbed. Jonathan stared at the photo, certain he was glimpsing his unknown tormentor for the first time. Then came the final straw. Senator Morgan called Jonathan, directly warning him that the Department of Justice was preparing an indictment for conspiracy fraud and violation of various federal regulations. Morgan could do nothing more to protect him. Jonathan was out of friends in high places. On the brink of ruin, Jonathan was forced to confront the possibility that an unknown woman held the fate of his empire in her hands. Yet he had no way of finding her, no way to reason with her, no way to end the siege. His once invincible kingdom tottered on the edge of a cliff ready to crumble. The collision was inevitable. The moment when Jonathan Ashcroft would meet the architect of his downfall was fast approaching, and she would appear not as a fleeting shadow, but as a force that would change his life and the fate of CodeLock forever. In the heart of the storm, Jonathan decided to confront his troubles head-on. He doubled his private security detail, tasked his best analysts with uncovering any digital footprints that could lead him to the culprit, and engaged top-tier crisis managers to salvage CodeLock's rapidly deteriorating public image. But it was Sabrina who unwittingly provided the breakthrough. After their argument, she distanced herself from Jonathan for a few days, wrestling with her own doubts about his methods. In that time, she discreetly began her own investigation, determined to help Jonathan from the sidelines if necessary. A former journalist, Sabrina had a knack for following leads, and she stumbled across a name that had remained in the shadows: Aurelia Lancaster. Diving into obscure archives, she connected Aurelia to a pattern of silent investments in companies that had later been destroyed by contra-provosts, similar to what was unraveling at CodeLock. Armed with this information, Sabrina confronted Jonathan in his office late one night. "I think I found her," she said, placing a slim folder on his desk. Inside, Jonathan saw pictures of Aurelia entering international summits, under aliases forging alliances with wealthy patrons, and sporadic references to legal battles that ended abruptly with sealed settlements. He leafed through the documents, his eyes widening at how meticulously she had stayed off the radar. Finally, he came upon a set of details that linked Aurelia to a philanthropic foundation, a foundation that had once tried to purchase advanced encryption software from CodeLock under a different name. Jonathan read the final page in silence. Aurelia's father had been embroiled in a high-stakes corporate scandal years ago, a scandal allegedly orchestrated by one of Jonathan's early acquisitions. That scandal had led to a chain reaction that ruined Aurelia's family, culminating in the suspicious death of a sibling. A chill ran down Jonathan's spine. "This is personal," he murmured. "She believes I'm responsible for what happened to her family." Sabrina nodded, her expression troubled. "But we can't confirm the details. Everything is conjecture from various sources, and Aurelia might not be acting alone. She's woven a web of alliances. At that moment, Jonathan's phone chimed. Another unknown message. If you seek absolution, come to the place where it all began. Attached was an address in Chicago, his old neighborhood. Jonathan grimaced, realizing Aurelia wanted him to return to his roots, to the place he had long abandoned. Unwilling to show weakness, but desperate for answers, Jonathan decided to make the trip in secret. He took a red-eye flight, accompanied only by 2 of his most trusted bodyguards. Sabrina insisted on joining, despite Jonathan's reservations. Together they ventured into the dimly lit streets, where Jonathan had grown up. The address led them to an abandoned warehouse near the old mechanic shop where his father once worked. With each echoing footstep, Jonathan felt the weight of memories. The smell of grease, the distant sound of car engines, and the faint recollection of his father's laughter. Near a flickering fluorescent light, a single figure stood waiting. Dressed in a dark overcoat, Aurelia Lancaster stepped into view. She was poised, her cool gaze locking on Jonathan. Sabrina and the guards stiffened, but Aurelia held up a hand, signaling she was unarmed. "So this is where you lived before you became Jonathan Ashcroft, the unstoppable billionaire," Aurelia said, her voice echoing softly in the cavernous space. Quaint. Jonathan's mind spun with questions, but he forced calm. "Why here?" "Because this is where your journey began," Aurelia replied, "and where mine ended." She paced slowly, her footsteps echoing. "Your company's ruthless expansion set off a chain reaction that destroyed my family. We lost everything. My father turned desperate, took shady loans to survive loans that spiraled into ruin. He died heartbroken and disgraced while you continued your triumphant march." Jonathan swallowed hard. "I didn't know. I never authorized. Spare me the ignorance." Aurelia snapped her composure, momentarily fracturing. "You built an empire without looking back. Your acquisitions, your deals, do you ever check the devastation you leave behind?" Sabrina, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Aurelia, I'm sorry about your father. But Jonathan, he's not the monster you imagine. Aurelia's gaze hardened. "Don't defend him. He's a man who sold software to regimes that torture their own citizens, all for profit." Jonathan raised a hand to silence Sabrina. He faced Aurelia, the woman who had orchestrated his downfall with surgical precision. "What do you want from me?" Aurelia exhaled, the faintest hint of relief crossing her face, as if she'd waited a long time for this confrontation. "I want the world to see who you truly are, and I want you to take responsibility for the damage you've caused." Jonathan looked around the worn walls of the warehouse, haunted by memories and the realization of how far he'd come and how far he'd fallen. For the first time, he felt the crushing weight of every decision he'd made in the name of ambition. There, in the dimly lit heart of his past, Jonathan stood face to face with the architect of his ruin. And he realized she was not merely seeking revenge, she was demanding repentance, and it was a debt he might never fully repay. In the fleeting moment of silence that followed, the air crackled with tension. Aurelia stared at Jonathan, her expression a mixture of anger and a twisted sense of resolve, while Sabrina lingered protectively nearby. Jonathan's bodyguards shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to intervene. Jonathan tried for composure. "I'm willing to talk. But if this is about vengeance," Aurelia cut him off with a curt laugh. "Vengeance, I used to think so. But then I realized you don't even know how much blood is on your hands. I'd be seeking vengeance from a ghost." Her words struck a chord. Jonathan felt the weight of her accusation. On paper, He could rationalize every deal he'd struck, every compromised alliance. But hearing the human cost from the person who'd borne it was a different matter. Aurelia straightened. You have a choice. The evidence against you, from illegal deals to your enabling of oppressive regimes, is already with key media outlets worldwide. They're scheduled to release it at midnight Eastern Time. Code Lock's stock will plummet. Your board will vote you out, and the Department of Justice will likely arrest you. Sabrina's face blanched at the finality of Aurelia's statement. Jonathan clenched his jaw, adrenaline surging. And what if I comply? What do you want me to do? She handed him a sealed envelope. Inside is a full confession. You sign it, issue it publicly, and resign from Code Lock. Cooperate with the authorities, and the release of the rest of the documents might be minimized. You might spare some of your company, and perhaps keep yourself out of prison. Jonathan's heart pounded as he stared at the envelope. He thought of the employees who depended on him, of the legacy he had built, one that now threatened to collapse like a house of cards. He took a shaky breath. If I sign, what guarantee do I have that you won't release everything anyway? Aurelia's gaze flickered with something close to pity. I can't prove my intentions to you, but trust me, Jonathan Ashcroft, if I wanted to destroy you fully, I would have let the leak happen already. Instead, I offered you this final choice. His fingers trembled as he took the envelope. He knew that signing meant relinquishing the power, the empire, and the identity he had spent his entire life forging. It meant admitting to the world and to himself that his rise had been built on more than just hard work and innovation. It was the apex of a moral reckoning that he had long evaded. He felt Sabrina's hand slip into his, a gesture of solidarity. Her voice wavered. Jonathan, please. If you can prevent more harm, if you can right even a fraction of the wrongs, do it. He squeezed her hand, his gaze not leaving Aurelia. Slowly he tore open the envelope and read the contents. The confession was thorough, implicating him in everything from coerced deals to unethical partnerships. He recognized some details he'd tried hard to bury, details only someone with inside information could possess. Steeling himself, he pulled a pen from his jacket pocket. His signature glided onto the document with surprising ease, as though every stroke relieved him of a burden he'd been carrying for too long. Aurelia watched in silence. When he was done, he handed the confession to her. Now what? Jonathan asked, his voice hollow. Aurelia took a step back, the envelope in her grasp. Now you face the consequences of your actions, possibly for the first time in your life. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the dimly lit corridors of the warehouse, leaving Jonathan, Sabrina, and the bodyguards in stunned silence. In the days that followed, Jonathan's resignation from Code Lock shook the tech world, though he tried to minimize the impact of the leaks by releasing a portion of the confession. The fallout was immediate. The board ousted him, and the company's valuation spiraled downward. Government agencies began legal proceedings, freezing Jonathan's accounts and ordering him to surrender his passport. Journalists swarmed. His name, once synonymous with genius and unstoppable ambition, became shorthand for corporate recklessness. Social media erupted with a mix of scorn, pity, and calls for stricter regulations. Protesters cheered his downfall as a victory against greed and corruption. Amid this chaos, Sabrina remained at his side quietly, urging him to use what influence he had left to mitigate the consequences for Code Lock's rank-and-file employees. He agreed surrendering much of his personal fortune to ensure severance packages and the preservation of at least some philanthropic programs he'd once championed. When federal agents finally arrived at his penthouse with an arrest warrant, Jonathan did not resist. As he was led away in handcuffs, cameras captured the final vestige of the man who had soared higher than anyone dared to imagine, only to plummet beneath the weight of his own sins. His empire had crumbled. The name Jonathan Ashcroft was no longer emblazoned on skyscrapers or courted at elite gatherings. He became instead a cautionary tale of ambition, run amok, a titan who conquered everyone until one unknown woman brought him to his knees. The public trial was as sensational as any in modern corporate history. Prosecutors presented reams of evidence, meticulously showing how Jonathan had manipulated deals, minimized oversight, and exploited legal loopholes to fuel CodeLock's rapid growth. Defense attorneys argued that many of the allegations were exaggerated, but Jonathan himself offered a surprising turn. He pleaded guilty to several counts, accepting responsibility and acknowledging the role his ambition played in harming others. Ultimately, he was sentenced to several years in a federal correctional facility, a fall from grace that reverberated across the globe. Journalists wrote think pieces on the ethics of technological expansion. Rival executives either distanced themselves from the scandal or used it to elevate their own reputations. Inside prison, Jonathan found himself in an environment he had never imagined, stripped of the luxuries and influence he once enjoyed. At first, he struggled trying to assert the same dominance he had in boardrooms, only to realize that nobody cared about his past fortunes. For the first time in his life, he was forced to confront himself without the armor of wealth or the distractions of power. Sabrina visited him every month, traveling a long distance to see him in the sterile visiting rooms. She provided updates. CodeLock was in restructuring talks, trying to salvage what was left of its core technology. Former employees were branching out into new ventures. Some were bitter. Others hoped Jonathan's downfall would pave the way for more ethical leadership in the tech world. Occasionally, Sabrina mentioned hearing whispers about Aurelia Lancaster. After Jonathan's conviction, she seemed to vanish. Those who claimed to know her said she resumed a quiet life of philanthropy, using her resources to aid communities harmed by corporate exploitation. Others believed she was preparing another mission, another confrontation with someone else, who thought themselves untouchable. In the evenings, Jonathan read voraciously. He revisited the old autobiography of Andrew Carnegie, the one that had once inspired him. This time, he focused not on the accumulation of wealth, but on Carnegie's philanthropic undertakings, his drive to give back once he had achieved success. Jonathan grappled with questions of morality, responsibility, and how easily a person could be corrupted when chasing a dream without considering the fallout. Near the end of his second year behind bars, Jonathan began volunteering in the prison's educational program, teaching basic computer skills to fellow inmates. He discovered a sense of fulfillment in offering something to others without expecting a return. Word of this spread, and even the prison staff noted a shift in his demeanor. Slowly, he earned privileges such as extended library access and the chance to participate in vocational workshops. Sabrina continued to be his anchor. On one visit, she brought a letter. "It was delivered to my old apartment," she said, handing it to him with trembling fingers. The envelope contained no sender's address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, elegantly handwritten. "Every fortress can be rebuilt if it stands on a foundation of truth. A." Jonathan stared at the note, a swirl of emotions churning within him. It felt like both an admonition and an invitation. In the final months of his sentence, he started drafting plans for a non-profit dedicated to ethical technology deployment. He envisioned a world where innovation didn't have to come at the cost of human rights or societal well-being. Though many would remain skeptical of his motives, Jonathan wanted to prove he had learned from his downfall. When he was finally released, he stepped out into a world that had moved on, a world that had learned to see him as a lesson rather than a leader. He was no longer the billionaire who conquered everyone. He was a man, stripped bare, compelled to start from scratch, mindful of the cost of arrogance and ambition unchecked. His next steps were not about reclaiming lost power, but about seeking a form of atonement, however partial or imperfect. In his pocket, he carried the note from Aurelia. Though she had undone his empire, she had also, through her merciless unveiling of truth, granted him a chance at redemption, a chance to rebuild on a foundation stronger than greed and ambition. And so Jonathan Ashcroft walked into the uncertain dawn of a new life, haunted by his past, yet fueled by the faintest glimmer of hope. He had been the billionaire who conquered everyone, until he was defeated by an unknown woman. Now he stood as a man armed with a painful lesson and a fragile dream of doing better. Only time would tell whether he would succeed. Jonathan Ashcroft's gripping saga shows how absolute ambition can consume even the brightest talents, and how a single determined individual can topple what seems untouchable. From humble beginnings to unimaginable power, Jonathan conquered rivals and rewrote the rules of business until Aurelia Lancaster revealed his fatal blind spot. Their confrontation was a collision of ambition and accountability, culminating in a downfall that captured the world's attention. Now we pass the story to you. If you found lessons in Jonathan's rise and fall, or inspiration in how a single truth-seeker can challenge even the mightiest empires, we invite you to be part of our community. Like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss future stories of power, drama, and redemption. Let's keep exploring the depths of human ambition and the sparks of hope that emerge when we finally face our darkest truths.